Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to CBI at 10. It is Tuesday. It is Tuesday, not Wednesday. Important to remember. This is going to throw my whole week out because I'm here a day early. My name is Liz Mosley. I'm an editor and partner at Tortoise, and we're joined today by the CBI All-Star home team to help us try and figure out what we heard yesterday from the Prime Minister as regards to the sort of roadmap out of lockdown. What we know, what we don't know, and what it all might mean. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come and listen. Please do make the most of this time, and if you do have particular questions, pop them in the question field in the webinar that you can see on the panel, and they'll come through to us, and we can ask the panel who joined us this morning to sort of answer them specifically. But we'll have a go anyway, starting with you, John. If we can, you're the Director of Policy and Communications at CBI, and you're kind of going to open the bidding this morning with a bit of a digest of what we heard. What did the Prime Minister tell us? What's in the very extensive and comprehensive 40-page detailed document? Start the bidding for us, John. What did we hear? What's going to happen next?
I will do. Good morning, Liz, and good morning to colleagues listening in. I think clearly yesterday was a really significant moment in the government's response to the pandemic. Now, the backdrop to the Prime Minister standing up was one of actually cautious optimism, and that's because we saw two really bits of good news over the weekend. I think first and foremost, we've seen some substantial progress on the vaccine, with the government confirming that their plans to vaccinate all over 50s by April the 15th was on track. And then alongside that, an ambition to vaccinate the entire adult population by the end of July. So really piece of good news. At the same time, Liz, we saw for the first time some early data that suggests that the vaccine is having an impact on reducing the transmission of the virus across society. So two really important pieces of good news as context. Now, I will talk through what the Prime Minister said. I will talk through what the CBI's headline reaction was. But before I do, just a little bit on the principles that feel like they are shaping this particular roadmap. I think first and foremost, the government have taken a uniformed nationwide approach rather than a return to tiers, which many firms operating across the UK told us they found hugely complicated, bureaucratic to navigate. So the government will ease restrictions at the same time across the whole of England. That's principle number one, uniformed nationwide. Principle number two is to focus on data rather than dates. So what we know is that it will take about 4 weeks for the data to show the impact of any easing of restrictions. Now, the government have provided an additional week, almost a kind of notice period for business and members of the public so that they can adjust and prepare as the steps increase. So that means at least 5 weeks between the various steps in the roadmap. Within the roadmap, there are indicative no earlier than dates. Now, these are all contingent on the data and are subject to change. So what I mean by that is if one step of the roadmap is pushed back by a week, the entire thing gets pushed back by a week. And I think the final principle that the government have focused on, and this is particularly around the sequencing of the easing of restrictions, is driven by the evidence of sources of transmission. And that is why they've put a big emphasis on outdoor activities first. You can see in the steps, there's a big focus on outdoor initially. And so they've tried to restore freedoms to people as quickly as possible, whilst minimizing the impact on transmission. Now, as well as the principles, Liz, we also had the 4 tests that were widely trailed over the weekend. Now, test number 1 is around successfully continuing to deploy the vaccine program. Test number 2 is around the evidence in hospitalizations and deaths from those members of the public who have been vaccinated, so reductions there. The third test is around infection rates and ensuring that we don't see a surge in hospitalizations that then puts the NHS under unsustainable pressure. And then the final test is the assessment that the government will take of risks, and that these risks don't fundamentally change by the introduction of new variants and new mutations to the disease. Now, assuming that each of those 4 tests are met in turn, there will be 4 steps to easing lockdown, or as it's been called, sort of 4 steps to freedom. And each of those has not before dates attached in them. And I'll just kind of run through those pretty briefly right now. So step 1 is the one that we knew was coming, or we hoped was coming, and that's the 8th of March. And that marks the really critical moment of reopening schools and further education across England. Now, some university students in England who require practical teaching can also return. And then for individuals, we will be allowed to leave the home for recreation, for exercise, but also to meet one other person socially. So coffees all round, no doubt, come March the 8th. And then almost part B to step 1 is the date of the 29th of March. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that that's the start of the Easter holidays. And this will mark the moment when people will be able to meet outside in groups of a maximum of 6 people or with one other household. And this will apply to all outdoor settings, including private gardens. Step 2 has a not before date of the 12th of April. And this will hopefully see the reopening of non-essential retail, of hairdressers, of close contact services, of gyms and spas. Hospitality venues will be able to open, but for outdoor table service only. The majority of outdoor settings and attractions can also reopen. So by that, we mean things like zoos, theme parks, drive-in cinemas, that kind of thing. And then finally, overnight stays away from home in the UK will be permitted, and self-contained accommodation will also be allowed to reopen. We then move to step 3, which will commence at the earliest on the 17th of May. And that will see, hopefully, indoor hospitality with table service reopening, indoor entertainment such as museums, cinemas, children's play areas, etc. The remaining elements of accommodation, so hotels, hostels, B&Bs, and some large indoor events, including conferences, theatre, conference performances, concert performances, I should say, and sporting events. And then finally, Liz, there will be special provision for up to 10,000 people at large outdoor seated venues where the crowds can be safely distributed. I think I certainly clocked that one as marking the final weekend of the Premier League season. And then finally, step 4, at the earliest on the 21st of June, and that will see all remaining restrictions lifted. So that will remove all legal limits on social contact, and it will include the reopening of all the remaining closed settings, including nightclubs and large events such as theatre performances. Now, just some quick reflections, Liz, on the CBI sort of headline take on what we heard yesterday. I think first and foremost, it does offer a flicker of hope that we can get back to business in the coming months. Now, on the positive side of the ledger, business, I think on the whole, backs the cautious step-by-step approach, because what it does do is hopefully bring an end to the damaging stop-start restrictions that we've seen for sort of nigh on 12 months now. So the fact that the Prime Minister's ambition is to reopen the economy irreversibly, as he put it, is really encouraging. We also saw schools reopening. Really, really important. This is a business priority, not just a social one. When we asked our members what are some of the top things that the government could do to support business, 1 in 4 said reopen schools. Really important that that March the 8th date is the anchor across which the roadmap is set. And then finally, in a couple of little extra bits of detail, we called for bespoke plans for those hardest to open parts of the economy. We didn't quite get those, and I'll touch on that in a little bit, but what we did get are plans for those really difficult parts of the economy. And then finally, one really important announcement that no doubt Tanya will touch on a little bit later is around the extension for government funding for workplace testing. Really important. So this has been extended for a further 3 months until the end of June. But for any firms wanting to apply for funding for workplace testing, there is a deadline of the 31st of March to get your applications in. But on the whole, good news. I think the challenge now is how do we turn the roadmap into genuine economic momentum. And we think the roadmap is almost part one of the story. Part two is still to come, and that's the budget that the Chancellor will deliver next week. And what the government now needs to do is provide a bridge for firms to get to the other side. And that is particularly important for those sectors, those parts of the economy, like hospitality, that are going to have to wait 3 months to reopen. And they face an incredibly anxious 9-day wait before they know what the Chancellor is going to tell them. And I think this is something that Rain will pick up in a bit more detail. But that financial support to provide a bridge, I can't emphasise just how important it is that we get that from the Chancellor next week. And then, Liz, I'll just finish on, I guess, some thoughts on the government's approach, if you like. I think first and foremost, what we did see yesterday marked a step change in government attitude, but also communications. So previous pronouncements have very much focused on what individuals and businesses can't do. Yesterday marked a real step change because it was the first time in a while that it was focused on what you can do, what businesses are able to do. Here are the freedoms that you will be able to utilize over a certain time frame. And that feels like it's a really welcome reflection point. I think secondly, the premium that the government have put on simplicity and uniformity is also to be welcomed. The previous restrictions, the tier system in particular, as I mentioned, was hugely complicated, really difficult to navigate for cross UK businesses, but also had loopholes and clauses in it. So what we're now seeing is there won't be any requirement for a substantial meal with a drink, no more Scotch egg with a pint. So that simplicity, I think, is to be welcomed. At the same time, by and large, they've tried to reopen sectors almost en masse. So just as an example, the last reopening last summer saw hairdressers and nail salons open at different times. What we've seen now is a much simpler. Personal care services can open all at once. If you're a business that has kind of multidisciplinary elements to it, that's really helpful. That makes it simple. And then finally, Liz, the roadmap does give the first glimpse, if you like, of a longer term view. So the government have framed it, how do we move from pandemic to endemic? How do we live with the virus? And within that, they've identified 4 work streams, 4 programs around the really difficult issues to crack about how we can deal with these issues with COVID from the summer onwards. So they're conducting reviews into 4 areas. Firstly, around COVID status certifications, where really importantly, they have acknowledged that there needs to be proper consideration for data, for privacy, for inclusivity. Secondly, around large events. So they will be running an events research program that will include large pilot events from April onwards. On international travel, the government have announced that they will be re-establishing the Global Travel Task Force chaired by Grant Shapps, and that is due to come back by the April the 12th with suggestions, rules, a roadmap, whatever you call it, for how we can reopen international travel. So important for our aviation industry, but actually much broader as well. And then finally, social distancing, where the government has also committed to undertaking a review before we move into step 4 that looks at things like the 1 metre plus rule and whether or not mask wearing will still be applicable going forward. And we'll be looking to feed into each of those reviews as the government takes them forward.
Thanks, John. There's a lot in there. That last chunk, your kind of plans for plans bit to do with COVID status certification, all the questions about data and privacy that have had people very concerned, I think is massive, and we should probably return to in a separate session. I would say there's Absolutely. A lot to get at in there. I'm very interested in this pilot events piece. It affects us directly at Tortoise. We're partly an events business too, and there's obviously events elements of lots of businesses. The global travel thing is huge, as you say. And questions I can see being submitted, one from David Woolard about thoughts about whole offices returning, that 4th element of that, the 1 metre plus rule, what screens do I need, do I still need them, all of that I think is all to play for. It would still seem to me, and your sense is that those 4 sort of unknowns or known unknowns or whatever, they'll filter through across the course of the steps. do we have a sense when we might start to hear outcomes of those plans for plans?
Yeah, so I think just for David's point around the return to office, so that any change in the return to office guidance, David, will be informed by that social distancing review that the government is looking to undertake. So that's likely to inform step 4 and the removal of all social contact. So we can probably expect that sometime around June. I think clearly for the events, the pilots being taking place in April, you'd imagine again that there'd want to be a proper period of time to analyse the data, see what's going on, etc. So again, looking to inform sort of step 3, step 4. And as I mentioned, that international travel, the Global Travel Task Force, looking to put together a plan for April the 12th so that international travel can get back and firing on all cylinders from May the 17th, which is the marker, the hopeful marker in the sand for step 3, if you will. I mean, if it's helpful, Liz, I can just pick up very quickly on some of the elements that we think are still missing. So I can imagine a lot of these questions, and David's question around the workplace is a really good one, about some of the areas that we think actually we just need to do a little bit more work with the government, and it is predominantly around guidance for the workplace. So I think one of the first questions that we've been grappling here is, will the COVID safer working guidelines still apply? Now, colleagues might remember that we worked with the TUC, other business organisations, the business department to get those up and running during the last reopening in the summer. Really effective piece of work. But clearly time has changed, things have moved on. So we need to know now, will those be adapted for testing and vaccinations? So for example, will the social distancing of 1 metre plus still apply? What requirements will there be for face coverings? That kind of thing. And it feels pretty clear that the government's social distancing review will certainly look at those.
Yeah.
I think secondly, Liz, there's clearly a pretty big interplay between testing, vaccines, and restrictions. So one of the questions that I've already been asked this morning is, will there be an ability to test and release from periods of self-isolation? So if one of your workers gets a ping on their phone but has been having regular lateral flow test, can we be released earlier so that person can get back to work? That's a pretty practical question we need an answer with. And then finally, there's this really, I think, tricky question that a lot of employers are grappling with, which is around the communications and the interactions between staff and vaccinations. I think people are worried that this feels like it could be a potential legal minefield. Firms have been very careful so far. They've communicated incredibly effectively with their people, but actually some government guidance about how best to do this, how to have those conversations, just to provide a bit of reassurance for firms would be hugely helpful. And then just to kind of, I guess, almost bridge to Rain, Liz, I'd be remiss if I didn't say the one thing that we are hearing, the one big gap right now, is that financial support. What is the Chancellor going to do next week to provide that bridge for those firms for whom reopening is still some way in the distance? That's incredibly important and certainly front and centre of our mind right now.
Thanks so much, John. I can see a couple of questions coming in that I will return to, but I'm conscious of time and I want to make sure we give enough airtime to Rain to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of what's coming in the budget and what will happen in the intervening period, and then to Tanya to just drill into the detail of what changed yesterday as regards testing, in particular workplace testing. There's some questions relating to that too. So morning, Rain, nice to see you. Thanks for being here. So we've got, what is it, 9 days till March the 3rd, and what we're going to hear from the Chancellor. From an economics perspective, how are you feeling? There's a sort of sense, and somebody's mentioned in the questions actually, that the statement yesterday, the sort of roadmap, maybe prioritise social interaction over business reopening. Is that your sense too?
Look, I think what was so hugely encouraging about yesterday is it set out that really clear plan for if things go as we expect, and those sort of 4 tests that John set out are met, we can gradually reopen the economy. And I think that is so hugely important because, look, what we've learned from around the world is if you tackle the pandemic well, if you tackle the impact on people's health, then the economy recovers behind that. So I think that's the first absolutely vital piece. Is the vaccination rollout here is having a huge impact. If that continues as planned, then we can gradually reopen the economy. Because I think what we do know from talking to businesses is it's the stop-start that's really toxic for businesses and how they can plan. So look, it may feel, and I think the government have prioritized some of that social interaction, partly to provide the sort of mental health support that we all need. The ability to see friends and family, I think, is really important. And they do have clear dates and indications as to when different parts of the economy can open up. So I think that's hugely positive, and it actually speaks a lot to the Bank of England's forecast for the economy. So look, the lockdown we've seen over this quarter will see the economy shrink this quarter, probably by around 4% is what the Bank of England expected. But then they expected the economy to grow by about 5% over the course of this year, and that was based on restrictions gradually being eased over the course of Q2 and over the second, and then any remaining over the second half of this year. And I think what we will see is when people are able to spend, we will see that household spending come back. And so I think no one is really concerned about consumption in the economy. I think when we have the ability to go to shops when they're open again, gyms, hairdressers, you name it, and we're all pretty desperate to get our haircut, I think that will come back very quickly. Exactly, me too. Can't wait. I've already booked April 12th, fingers crossed. So I think that is hugely encouraging. What is difficult is just getting businesses investing and having certainty that this will be the last time that we are facing these restrictions, and that we have the support in place to build the bridge to the other side. And look, there are some sectors we're particularly concerned at where we do need to see that targeted support. Aviation, absolutely critical. International travel, we will see what happens around the 12th of April, when that report will come back. But we may see more restrictions for a period of time, and that sector has just faced such challenges over the past year. And there's many others we've talked about besides: hairdressers, nail salons, those sort of businesses. So I think we do need to see that support in place from the Chancellor when he stands up next week.
The last time we spoke, Rain, you and I, a few weeks ago, we talked about the cliff edge of the existing support packages and the hockey stick, the kind of frightening hockey stick of repaying those, and how you were kind of asking for an easing, sort of balancing out, softening of those curves. Has there been any progress on that? Do we have any new indications that the Chancellor has taken that on board?
So I think we've definitely seen progress, particularly around the repayments of loans, the pay as you grow. There was some, it hadn't quite been implemented, but it is now in place. So businesses can stretch the repayments of loans over 6 to 10 years, and that is really vital. But actually the real cliff edge, and what we really need to see the Chancellor act on at the budget next week, and I am feeling positive he will act. He has done shoulder to shoulder with business so far. But what do we absolutely need to see? First of all, it's about the furlough scheme, the job retention scheme. At the moment, I do feel it would have been good to have an announcement sooner than we've seen already. That's due to come to an end at the end of April. I'm pretty confident that will stay in place, as we have asked for, in its current form till the end of June. And you see that if it does, that's really well synced with the sort of reopening of the economy. I think at the end of June, we then need to see some form of tapering in the job retention scheme. I think for some sectors, you may need to see continued support. And I guess it would be aviation, live events, some of the areas where there may still be a gradual reopening over the second half of this year. So some tapering in the job retention scheme, but absolutely we need that in place till the end of June. So important for businesses and for households who are depending on it. Then there's a series of measures that could be taken to smooth the cliff edge and other support. So business rates relief, hospitality, leisure and retail have had relief from business rates. That runs out at at the end of March. So we need to see that extended at least for a 3-month period, just to, you know, because some of these businesses won't be open. It's crazy that they would have to be paying significant tax to the government before, when they're not making any revenues. Business rates comes out of your bill before you've made any profit. It comes out of your revenues. So it's a fixed cost for business. So that's something we absolutely need to see. And finally, there are measures that could be done to ease some of the pressure on cash flow that would help some of the businesses in supply chains. So again, targeted business rates relief from manufacturers who supply into the hospitality and leisure sectors, those businesses that are still closed, and things that can be done around VAT deferrals, just smoothing some of the repayments of the VAT bill from last year, which was deferred. That's due to start to be paid again from April, just deferring that till June. Again, it's all about creating a bit of breathing space for businesses to get through this next quarter, which is still going to be challenging for some of them. So that then we have a really healthy economy. We have the capacity from the supply side, so that when we are all ready to go out and spend, to go to the gym, to go to live events, we have the critical businesses there able to deliver, and we can get our economy growing sustainably.
Thanks so much, Rain. I'm going to come to Tanya, who's waited patiently, because the devil is really in the detail with all of this, Tanya. And we're going to have a go at testing in a second. But I just wonder if there might be a couple of answers that you could give to a couple of questions that have come in. Firstly, and we did speak about this, although it might be more one for Rain, a few weeks ago, when we talked to the CEO of the Masham Brewery up in Yorkshire, that there's a point here being made. There are so many companies that rely on hospitality and travel, but that aren't strictly speaking hospitality and travel. And we talked about the sort of adjacent sectors and where support packages are being fielded for the sort of headline sector. All of the sort of cascading suppliers of those sectors need to be specifically included in those two. And then a second question, which I think is similar from somebody who's come in to say, we're a gaming business on the high street. Operationally and functionally, we are non-essential retail with no close contact, no eating or drinking. But we don't know if we are counted as non-essential retail indoor leisure or indoor hospitality, which is a bit later. I suppose my question to you is, if you're looking at your business and thinking, well, do I count? You know, which bucket do I fall into? Do I get the coverage? What do you do with your question? Because by default, the government guidance is it has to be broad brush at this stage, I guess. Well, who do you ask? Where do you go if you have that question? Tanya, is that something that you could help with, perhaps? If you're thinking, oh, I fall between two stools, am I a 12th of April or a 17th of May person?
Yeah, definitely. I'll let Rain come in on the support bit, because that's definitely something that we've iteratively learned about in terms of the supporting supply chains for lots of different sectors. And as you rightly said, at the moment, it is quite broad brush. We are looking back at those definitions that we previously had on what is non-essential retail versus essential retail, and government guidance is going to be updated. So I would check on, the gov.uk website. But what we have done is stuck to those definitions that we've become more accustomed to throughout responding to the events of the last year. So completely understandable on that point. And I think, going back and falling as to how you've operated throughout this period, especially for those, there will be those unique cases that fall in between the cracks, and especially, looking at how you define what is close contact versus sort of outdoor activity. But obviously, it's easier right now when you're looking at opening up in stages to keep on those sort of wide definitions. But I'll let Rain come in on the support point.
What do you think, Rain, in terms of what can we see in terms of what counts, doesn't count as hospitality, for example?
So I think a few things. I'd sort of say, I think one of the things that's top of our kind of work list at the CBI is, one, obviously ensuring the financial support, but secondly, just really helping businesses work through that workplace guidance, what can be open, what can't. So it's these sort of questions. We will go back to the business department and more broadly to get these things clarified where it isn't clear already whether a particular type of business can open at specific dates. I think on the wider support for some of these businesses, it's absolutely, that's why we've sort of made the case that we need to keep some of these schemes going for longer, so that the job retention scheme is available for businesses who need that. We're looking at business rates relief, not just to businesses that are closed, but those who are in the supply chain of businesses that are closed. I do think that's really important, because many of those supply chain businesses have had very little support. And actually, interestingly, the aviation sector as well has had, very little direct support, and yet their revenues have been one of the sectors that's been most hardest hit through these crisis. And that's also why some of these more general support, like VAT deferrals, it's self-selecting. Businesses are only going to use that deferral if they're really facing weak revenues and need that sort of cash flow support, because it's a way of making sure that they're only sort of paying money into the government once revenue has come back to their business. So it is absolutely about having that whole economy support.
Thanks so much, Rain. Okay, Tanya, so let's do testing then. Now, testing is obviously a key enabler, particularly for test 3, the infection rates not rising so much that they risk a surge in hospital admissions. And the guidance around workplace testing in particular, it did change a bit yesterday, didn't it? What was new that we heard yesterday that people need to be aware of?
Yeah, so actually some really big announcements yesterday on workplace testing and funding for workplace testing beyond the current end date, which was March the 31st. So we've got that extension now until end of June, which is really welcomed, because many of those on the call will have listened to Dido Harding, who came on here when that first announcement came about in January. And just yesterday we spoke to Ben Stimpson from NHS Test and Trace also about the importance of workplace testing. So great news there on the extension. What I'd like to tell everybody listening on is that you need to go and sign up and register by the end of March to apply for that scheme, and that's even if your business is currently closed. So if you're going to be part of reopening from sort of March to June, please do sign up now, because it is really clear that this is going to be a twin track approach, that whilst we do have vaccinations, which is excellent news, testing is here to stay and it will be normalised. It's a way of meeting those 4 tests, as you said, and actually helping to see sort of where infection levels are at throughout the community, but also helping to monitor, the effectiveness of vaccinations as well. Secondly, we've also got the extension of community testing. So for those businesses that were smaller than that 50 head count who can go and sort of access testing from local authorities, that has also been extended to the end of June. So also a very welcomed announcement. Then thirdly, we're also going to get a new setup to enable those that are self-employed or smaller businesses than sort of the 50 headcount to access testing themselves. So that's really good, because some of those businesses have fallen through the cracks and would have wanted to know where can they get support from. So that's all really good news. Then fourthly as well, we've got confirmation that actually the government is looking at providing those testing kits to be used at home. I know that's something that loads of businesses have been asking us about, mainly because of the logistical, difficulties and operational difficulties of getting everybody, coming to work and doing those tests. So that is being looked at. So I know that will come as a relief to many. And then fifthly, we had an extension of support for self-isolation. So many of you, would have read that, self-isolation continues to be a problem. And so, those payments now for local authorities, they've been given access to 20 million funding each month to help with the self-isolation issue, and also additional services through local authorities to help those that need to self-isolate. So access to shopping, access to care, etc. So we've got a whole suite of support measures now, which is really welcomed on testing. And it is actually showing us that we've got more tools in our armoury now, and testing being one of them in terms of the roadmap to summer 2021.
Thanks, Tanya. And there's a person has sort of put a note in the questions that they're struggling with the application process itself. They employ 220 people all over the UK, and they're struggling to get an answer on whether their application has been successful. Is that something you've heard a lot, or do you think that person's just been unlucky in the application process itself?
No, absolutely. If anyone is having difficulties with the process, we are taking all of those queries away and filing them through to the Department of Health teams. You know, they have been sort of inundated with lots of applications, but we are here to help, and that's how we have been helping to progress workplace testing from it becoming sort of a very sort of nascent concept to now becoming normalised. So if you have any issues, please do send them across to myself and the team, and we're more than happy to help.
That's really good. Thanks so much, Tanya. And then another one, which we may have covered between yourself and John about workplace testing. There is reference to workplace testing within the roadmap twice a week. Any thoughts on how this may impact the COVID secure guidelines and the likelihood of it being mandated?
Yeah, definitely. So we did touch a little bit on yesterday's webinar, so we'd also welcome attendees to watch yesterday's piece as well. In terms of the COVID secure guidance, as John mentioned, there is actually a commitment from government to review the COVID secure practices in line with workplace testing and also with that social distancing review. So there is a separate review that will take place on the guidelines to understand now, with all of these additional measures that we have in place, how can we flex that guidance. There isn't any date on when that COVID secure guidelines will be reviewed, but that's what we'll be working with BEIS and Department for Health as well on that. In terms of mandation, at the moment, all of sort of workplace testing is a voluntary scheme, and from the experiences that we've had with workplaces, the fact that it's voluntary and having that employee-employer relationship in terms of why the testing process has been put into place has really helped. It's actually shown to employees the importance of health and safety for not only them but their families. So it's not currently, in terms of on the agenda, completely being mandated, because actually to achieve the desired outcome, actually the voluntary basis seems to be working the best.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then I think you may have just answered this question, but let me just double check, because someone's written a specific question about, will the lateral flow testing at home for those who are working but you can't be tested in the workplace, is that going to be made available under the scheme?
So currently the testing is only for those who cannot work from home.
Okay.
And the idea is that, in time, for those that cannot work from home, being able to do the home test before they get to work. So that's the indication that's been given in the roadmap guidance at the moment. Just to pick up on something that John touched on, is this messaging around work from home, does that continue? And what happens to those individuals eventually that can then go back to the workplace? So we're looking at sort of the office workers here. Now that is slightly more ambiguous as to how workplace testing will work for those that will then sort of return back to those workplaces where they have been able to work from home up until now. What's interesting to see is that work from home message is staying in the roadmap until that step 4, sort of looking at mid-June. But what we have seen now is that after the first step, so after March the 8th, looking at March the 29th, because the stay-at-home order does then change, because then people allowed more social interaction, the messaging on work from home is please work from home where you can. And members on the core businesses will be familiar that we were in this similar language territory a little bit last year in summer, where then businesses were making provisions for those that could not actually feasibly work from home easily, cramped flats, difficult sort of family situations, living arrangements, etc., where they were allowed to give sort of reasonable adjustment to enable a small set of individuals to come back to the workplace. That is less clear. The message is, where possible. And that's something that we'll be talking with government this week to get clarity on that and how that actually gradually, improves up until June the 21st.
Yeah, definitely one to watch, because the onward impact to the rest of the business community of being in the office is obviously so huge. And then a question here from Carolyn on home testing as well. Do you have a sense, Tanya, that if you request home testing for your business, you'll get it? Is it sort of anybody can if you want it?
So at the moment, there have been pilots, so businesses as part of the workplace testing scheme at the moment through Department of Health have been trialling this, and it's all about getting sort of regulator approval for the use of these tests. Obviously, at the moment, if you take a test, you're not then responsible for reading the outcome, processing the test as well, and that's the new additional bit that we're going to have to do. So it requires quite a significant educational piece to make sure that individuals are understanding the process, the amount of time that you need to leave the test, and then read the result correctly. And obviously then there is that ownership on the individual that they've read the test, and how do you link that back to the workplace before coming into work. So there is a bit of a process and trial and error taking place. So there are some workplaces currently helping the government see what that would look like in practice and what that process should look like.
Fine, thank you so much, Tanya. Really, really helpful, and thank you for your questions too. I'm going to come back to John because I'm conscious we've just got a couple of minutes left, but I'm kind of going to go full circle and back to the very beginning. You talked, I think, very helpfully about there's 4 weeks and then a buffer week, and if everything moves back, then it all sort of shunts along. So just because we understand that all 4 tests need to be met in order that any of these dates are kept, I'm clear on that. What is your sense of what could happen, for example, between now and the 8th of March, for the 8th of March to be missed as a reopening deadline? When will we hear from that? How is the sort of updating of the progress going to transpire?
Yeah, it's a good question, Liz. So it feels to me like, barring anything really substantial changing in the next week or so, which feels unlikely because all the data, all the direction of travel, the 8th of March feels relatively locked in to me, if I'm honest. It's one of the firm dates in the roadmap. All the others have things like, at the earliest by. So I think if you're a business preparing, I think we can think with pretty strong confidence that that 8th of March schools reopening is going to take place. Clearly, what we need to look at is what impact that has over that 5-week time period on the government's 4 tests. And I think that will give us a pretty good indication as to whether we're going to be on track for hitting some of those next steps in the roadmap, or actually whether there might be any delay. But 8th of March feels relatively cemented into me.
And then we will hear daily, I guess, from the government what it's looking like as to whether the 29th of March is a goer or not a goer. Do you think that it will be, they'll wait, a minimum of a week to indicate to people, sorry, the 29th of March is off, or do you think that they will indicate it as soon as they know?
So again, it feels to me like the 29th of March feels relatively confident. If you listen to the press conference yesterday, both Chris Whitty and colleagues were talking with good confidence about the reduced risk of transmission outside. So that's why I mentioned at the start one of the principles. So that 29th of March, people being able to meet in slightly bigger groups outside, again, feels something that people can start to think about with relative certainty. I think clearly what the government has done so far is make sure they've got all the data before making any informed decisions that they then communicate to the public. Now, clearly the daily press conferences will be able to give indications. The data is obviously moving in the right way. People will be watching it like an absolute hawk when schools go back on the 8th of March. So I think we'll have sort of indications as to how things are going, but any sort of changes further down the line, you'd imagine that the government would want to be really clear. This is the moment when we're going to communicate to business, to the general public, whether or not there's been any change. But, let's be optimistic. Let's hope that things will stay on track and we can move through those steps as identified.
Brilliant. Agree, John. Thank you so much. Cautiously optimistic is the order of the day. And as we said, it's going to be 17 degrees in London this afternoon. So get your bikini on, everyone. Spring has sprung, and let's have a good day. It's been a really, really helpful and detailed packed session. Thank you very much to Tanya, of course, to Rain and to John, and to you all for joining us. And do come back again. Alice shared a link to yesterday's webinar if you really want to dig into the detailed test and trace with Ben Stimson, and there's some useful extra stuff in there that we didn't cover this morning. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day. We'll see you again. Bye.